You're watching The World from Below and I'm Lizzie O'Shea. Today we're talking with Palestinian playwright and activist Samah Sabawi and Jewish historian Dr. Jordy Silverstein. What you just saw coming back from the break was footage of protests around the world against the war on Gaza, and the resistance to the bombing of Gaza will form the next part of our discussion. The Canberra Declaration on Gaza has been signed now by 72 current and former members of Parliament, including former PM Malcolm Fraser. The declaration calls for the cessation of hostilities and an end to the occupation. Samah, what do you make of the Australian political response to Operation Protective Edge?
I think that the letter was a very good step forward that you've just mentioned, that was signed by the various MPs. But it's not enough to declare, denounce, make statements. Julia Bishop called the school, she had a very strong statement on the bombing of the UN school. But all of this is not enough in the absence of real political action to change the status quo. For as long as Australia puts its support behind the occupier, the aggressor, Israel, and without taking into consideration the right for the Palestinians to defend themselves. How many times have we heard our government say that Israel has a right to defend itself? And the question that really comes to mind every time I hear it is, who's protecting the Palestinians? Who's protecting the Palestinians? Israel has to protect them under international law because it occupies them. They are under its occupation, but it's not doing that. And nobody ever talks about the security for the Palestinian people. People, you hear our politicians say that, Israel's demand to demilitarize the Palestinian resistance. It goes without notice, as if it's just a normal thing to say. Well, you're talking about a people who have a very long track record of committing atrocities against the people they occupy. And instead of calling for sanctions against Israel, and instead of putting an arms embargo on Israel, or in the least going to the UN Security Council and passing some resolutions with teeth that would stop Israel from its continuous aggression against the Palestinians, we're all talking about demilitarizing the Palestinians, and we're all talking about Israel's security, but never about the Palestinian security. When you're looking at your television station, all you see on your TV screens are Palestinian women, children being pulled out of the rubble of their own homes. They're the ones that need us to speak about their security, and no one's doing that. So I think Australia's position is not enough. It doesn't even come close enough. I think we need to be able, as a country that has some significance on the international stage, to actually take some firm action to stop these atrocities from taking place.
Dr. Jordy Silverstein, how do you see this response in comparison to our past history in respect of similar conflicts that we've seen in Israel-Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, it seems, this is, I guess, almost the best we could hope for from, I think, the Australian political class, I guess, in that way. This kind of, I don't remember previous letters being issued in previous conflicts, and I might be wrong, but I don't remember a similar letter being issued in the last couple of times that Israel has attacked Gaza. So I think this is certainly a step in the right direction, but it's, insufficient, I guess.
It does call for an end to the occupation, which I find somewhat surprising. It's perhaps more aggressive than I thought that they would ever be, but I'm interested to know whether that's something that surprised you at all.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I guess. Yes. I mean, it's also it's noticeable that it's not there aren't really liberal signatories to it. Malcolm Fraser's the only Liberal Party signatory to it.
It's not an official letter in that sense. It's just
Yeah.
Tell me, Jordy, let's talk about boycott, divestment and sanctions. What do you think the impact on that campaign will be from this recent conflict in Gaza?
I think the campaign's going to improve, and I think we're already seeing that. We're already seeing, there's countries have already withdrawn military, stopped selling military hardware to Israel, and there's been pressure, and I guess people, activists connected to BDS campaigns have been putting pressure on companies to stop selling arms to Israel. So I think, we're already seeing more activists going directly to companies in the US, in Europe, and making those claims and identifying around the BDS campaign. I think we're also seeing that in Australia. We're seeing more students becoming interested. I think there's just kind of no doubt that the world has paid attention to what Israel has done this time. People don't understand it. people are outraged that this has happened, and people want to do something. And I think the BDS movement is a really clear campaign, and people will join it.
It's interesting that you raise students, because I know there was a lot of controversy when the universities were bombed as part of this campaign by the IDF, and that's come in the wake of, particularly in Australia, quite a lot of controversy about the academic boycott of Israeli education institutions, with Professor Jake Lynch from Sydney University being sued under the Racial Discrimination Act for refusing to endorse a professor visiting from the Hebrew University. As an academic, can you tell me how you think the BDS campaign is going on campuses?
Yeah, and I guess, the other side of it as well as Israel bombing Gazan universities, Israeli universities, and in particular Tel Aviv University and Hebrew University of Jerusalem, are the two that have stood out of actively supporting the war effort, of offering free tuition for soldiers, of sending care packages. Like those universities have really supported what has happened. So I think what those two dual actions demonstrate is that academia is not immune, that academia is part of it. And we know that, exactly.
Sure.
And that's something that we know, right? That we know that...
a lot of the research that goes into the weapons that gets used is actually done on university campuses as well. So it's not apart from the system, it is part of the system. And it's important also, because you mentioned Jake Lynch, to say that these charges were dropped.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to talk, Samah, about protests that we've seen in the West Bank, which is something perhaps we haven't seen as much of in previous years. Tell me, do you think that's something we can expect to see more of in the future?
Absolutely. I think people in the West Bank are doing their best, of course, given the circumstances that they're in. But I think whenever we talk about the West Bank, I always like to point out that there are no rockets coming out of the West Bank. And yet we're looking at tens of Palestinians killed this year alone by the Israeli army, mostly in nonviolent protests. Palestinian children by the hundreds get kidnapped from their beds in the middle of the night by the Israeli army. So the whole claim again that Israel is defending itself against the Palestinians doesn't really wash when you look at the second half, which is the West Bank, and how Israel has treated the Palestinians under occupation in a very appalling and brutal manner. But yes, we should expect to see more protests in the West Bank, especially given that the peace process, so-called, has really come toward the end of the road. And Palestinians know that they are one people. They know that they have the same problems, and that their problems come from the same occupying power that occupies them. Never before have Palestinians been so united, and never before have they seen with clarity what their goals should be and how to get there.
I do think it's somewhat more sobering statistic is the polls showing great approval for the conflict within Israel itself. Do you have any insights on that to offer, Jordy?
I mean, my understanding is that a lot doesn't get reported about what is happening in Gaza within Israel proper. So I guess people are unaware, and what they're experiencing is the sirens and their rush to bomb shelters. And people aren't, the Jewish Israelis aren't interested, I guess, in finding out and talking about what's actually going on in Gaza and to Palestinians. So I think that's part of it, is people don't know and aren't wanting to find out. But there's also, I guess, that kind of war mentality where people really shut down, and there's been, there have been protests against the war. There's no doubt there's been protests, and there's been many pieces written by left-wing Jewish Israelis against what's going on, but these people also then get attacked. And the rise of what can only be described as fascism, right, of fascist attacks by Jews against Jews, is quite horrifying, I guess. And yeah, I mean, left-wing protests, they're consistently being attacked. Left-wing journalists are consistently being threatened. And it's quite terrifying, I guess.
Great. I'd like to thank you both for coming in to speak with us today. If I had my way, I think you'd be in charge of the peace process. But unfortunately, that's all we have time for on this week's episode of The World from Below. I'd like to thank again our guests, Samah Sabawi and Dr. Jordy Silverstein. I'd also like to thank all our crew and producers and our host, RMI TV. You've been watching The World from Below. We'll be back at the same time next week. See you then.